During the escape, I fell into the mud, feeling an inexplicable fear. Suddenly, a sharp pain hit me, and I lost consciousness. Chapter 24. All hell. The minute Riley snapped the girl's neck, Cade screamed. It was a sound unlike anything he'd ever heard. He immediately lunged forward and broke free from the person holding him back. He was the only one charging the wolf. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfading patience, enthusiasm. Countless figures burst from the trees behind us. Men and women brandishing silver weapons charged the three men, their screaming drowning out Codess. Maria slipped behind them as she and Margaret barked orders. The werewolves, however, had been expecting this. The minute people emerged from the trees, wolves appeared across the clearing. Though there weren't as many of them as the humans, there was enough. Even I could tell it was going to be much of a fight. Each wolf was a different size and color, and each one seemed to have some sort of feral air to them. There wasn't a single shred of humanity in their eyes, as it seemed they'd abandoned that long ago. The original three didn't bother to shift. The wolves parted around them as they watched the scene unfold. My blood ran cold as the first human met the first wolf, and chaos ensued. Weapons were being lunged into fur. Teeth were cutting through skin. The only thing I could hear was the countless cries of pain as a new target was met. Through the chaos, I watched a familiar figure stalk towards me, a fire blazing in their eyes. Margaret was following behind Maria, who was lifting a gun out of her waistband. For the first time since I met her, I saw something shine in her eyes. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Before they could come any closer, Samuel was screaming with rage. I whipped my gaze just in time to see him burst forward from the tree and lunge at Maria. Before she could fire her weapon, Samuel was on top of her. I heard her scream, but it was cut short by two gunshots ringing through the trees. Margaret stood next to the duo, arms extended and pointed at Samuel. His roars echoed trees, and then suddenly he was alone. Bridie appeared next to Margaret, hitting the gun out of her hands. She whirled around to face him, but before she could, her head was ripped clean from her neck. I heard myself scream, but the noise was drowned out by everyone around me. My hands pulled desperately against their restraints as I watched Margaret's body crumple, blood spitting from the gaping hole where her head once was. Riley paid her no mind as he stooped down to where Samuel rested. He raised him from the ground, but his body was limp. Riley wrapped his arm underneath Samuel and started carrying him away, but not before he sent a sickeningly forceful kick to Aria's head. Her hair fell to the side and blood started oozing from her ear. I stayed silent, frantically working on the rope that had my hands tied, as Riley dragged Samuel back through the chaos. Then, suddenly, my hands were released. I quickly brought them forward as I heard someone move from behind me. My gaze rested on a dark figure holding another man at his side, and I recognized Cade immediately. I looked at him and the ropes, confusion lacing my features. I'm sorry this happened. Breathlessly, his eyes darted behind me before he continued, his voice pained and cracking. I just wanted my family back. And with that, he was gone. He disappeared into the trees and I was left kneeling on the ground. It only took another second and a glance at the fight behind me before I drew after him. I was running after Cade, but I knew HE'd be going in the right direction to get away from everything. I didn't pay attention to the noise behind me, the burning in my side, or the warning signals sounding in my mind. My eyes scanned the terrain as I expected to pass Cade and the other man any second, but I never found them. That didn't thwart me though, as I was concerned with finding them. The only thing I could think about was running. My limbs were heavy and they tripped over every fallen branch, every random twig. I wasn't making a lot of progress, no matter how desperately I tried. My body was tired. I hadn't eaten. It barely had any water or sleep. In the last few days, it walked miles upon miles without stopping. So it was in this moment, where I needed my body most, that it was deciding to fail me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry and throw my fist into a tree. But I focused every last thread of my energy into putting one foot in front of the other. I listened carefully to the forest behind me, trying to detect any signs that I was being followed. I didn't hear anything, but I knew that meant nothing. The forest was the wolves' domain, and they could easily conceal themselves. As I stumbled forward once more, I tripped over an uprooted tree. I couldn't catch my footing before I fell, and I ended up lying face first in the mud. I quickly tried to lift myself back up, but the atmosphere around me suddenly changed. I don't know if it was a shift in the air or perhaps the trees warning me of the danger, but somehow I knew something was terribly wrong. Someone was here. Fear coursed through my veins as my limbs froze in place. My heart pounding in my chest was the only thing I could hear. I stayed plastered to the ground, somehow knowing what was going to happen before it hit me. Pain, a flash of red. Then, darkness. When I awoke, I only knew one thing. I was cold. My body was shivering and my limbs were cold around myself, trying to conserve what little heat I had left. However, as I laid there, I knew there wasn't any more to be found. I slowly opened my eyes, not eager to face reality, though I desperately tried not to. I remembered everything. The run, the flash of red, and then the darkness. I wanted to stay there and let my mind be filled with its seclusion, but I never got that mercy. Life wasn't even kind enough to slowly guide me back to the light. It didn't allow me to forget a thing. Reality was hitting me like the daggers of ice spreading across my skin. My eyes slowly adjusted to my surroundings, and what I saw surprised me. A familiar stone room with a used for peat in the middle. The door leading outside and into the forest was to my left. The small back room it snuck out of was directly across from me. I was in the hold safe house. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing Clichet's enthusiasm. I thought I was alone, but as I scanned the room my gaze landed on a heap by the repeat. I immediately recognized the heap as Samuel. Scenes from the clearing entered my mind, and all I could think about was Riley dragging away Samuel's lifeless body. But sitting here, watching his chest slowly rise and fall, I knew better than to think him dead. My body twitched violently as I tried to adjust my position. I tried to hold back my groan, but I was successful. At the noise, the door to the small room opened and two figures emerged. I kept my gaze down low, as I knew exactly who they would be. Looks like one of you is finally awake, Riley suddenly spoke. I didn't respond, but I heard the two men's footsteps draw closer to me. My heart started pounding in my chest as I closed my eyes, fearful of what they would do. Oh, come on, Samantha. We don't bite. That's Samuel's job. My breath caught in my throat and I suddenly looked up. Riley was standing next to Samuel's unconscious body. But he was watching me. His eyes followed the other man as he walked around the room and towards the front door. Don't be too long, Bray, Riley voiced. The figure of Peyton Bray paused, nodding towards Riley. I won't. He quietly exited the building. I suddenly found myself alone with Riley. Fear twisted my heart and clouded my vision as I watched him slowly walk the length of the room. I tried again to sit up as he got closer to me, but my body wouldn't move. He watched me curiously as I flinched again, my hands flying to hold my side. You're bleeding, Riley stated. I tried not to roll my eyes. I had a few things I wanted to say, but I knew I wouldn't have as much forgiveness with Riley as I did with Samuel. You're allowed to speak. You know. I shook my head, avoiding his gaze. Well then, this is going to be rather boring. I watched him and he slumped against the wall next to Samuel. He breathed heavily once more, watching his lifeless figure. Archie's going to be okay. You know. I stayed silent, but my eyes were trained on Samuel as well. The sound of gunshots kept ringing in my ears, and I couldn't help but wince. Do you even care? Riley suddenly asked. My eyes shifted to look at him. He didn't seem angry or hostile, merely curious. I thought about not responding, as I wasn't even sure what I would tell him. Did I care? Yes, I slowly responded. I hoped it was the correct answer. Riley laughed. Interesting. I shuddered at his laughter. Holding myself tighter, I felt unbelievably weak and vulnerable, lying there in the fetal position, though there wasn't much I could do about it. Riley said a few things to himself, none of which I caught. After his voice died off though, he abruptly got up and walked towards the front door. He hesitated as he put his hand on the wood. Suddenly, his voice was much darker. Don't do anything stupid. And with that, he left. I was alone in the small building, breathing heavily, freezing cold, and dying to be anywhere but here. I tried to ignore my body's protests as I again attempted to lift myself off the ground. I knew it was stupid and feeble, but that didn't stop me. If I was given the chance, I would run. I refused to sit idly by and let the monsters kill me. I managed to pull myself up into a sitting position. As I was mustering the strength to kneel, I eyed Samuel warily. He was still passed out on the floor, lying next to the fire. His limbs were awkwardly positioned around him, and the moon sent shadows dancing across his body. I didn't know how much longer he would be passed out, but I hoped it would last a bit longer. I just needed one more chance. Almost as if he sensed my hope, Riley sauntered back into the shanty building to crush it. His red eyes quickly scanned the room once over, resting on me for just a moment. He smiled to himself as he moved to the center of the room and dropped a bundle of wood into the fire-pit. I watched his movements carefully as he took a lighter from his pocket and lit the wood on fire. He then pulled Samuel closer to the flame, warming his body. As I watched the flames grow larger, I suddenly wanted nothing more than to be next to them. But I stayed put. I didn't think I'd be able to move. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. When the fire was stoked and Riley was satisfied with Samuel, he moved to the back room where he fished out some old blankets. He came back and laid a few across Samuel before surprisingly tossing one in my direction. I caught the soft material and quickly wrapped it around myself, welcoming the warmth I knew it would bring. Not only that, but the new weight on my shoulders calmed me slightly, acting as an anchor for my anxious heart. Riley's voice suddenly rang out. You know, if you were a good mate you'd be doing all this. I furrowed my eyebrows and buried my head in my knees as I slowly raised them to my chest, relishing in the new warmth creeping across my body. I didn't respond to Riley, as I didn't know what he wanted me to tell him. I could hardly move, let alone carry firewood and cuddle my soulmate. I heard Riley sigh heavily. I watched him through pieces of my hair as he repositioned a few more things and then slowly wandered to my side of the room. My breathing hitched the closer he came, but he didn't stop his advances. My eyes quickly darted between him and Samuel, and I suddenly prayed he would wake up. Riley wouldn't be able to come after me, or at least I hoped. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. My prayers were never answered, and Riley came to sit right next to me. I quickly tried to move away, but he held up a hand. I froze my movements, fear taking control of my body. We need to have a talk. I slowly raised my gaze to meet his eyes. They were cold and calculating, entirely different from before. Questions were dancing in my mind, and it seemed Riley knew every single one could be answered with one name: Samuel. I looked over at his lifeless frame. Riley followed my gaze, his shoulders stiffening. I didn't want to respond, but he seemed to be waiting for me to answer him. What about him? I slowly asked, my voice cracking. Well, I should clarify. Samuel and you. I waited breathlessly as Riley settled himself, shifting his weight to lean against the wall. His frame seemed relaxed, but I knew better. His hands twitched and his eyes never rested. When I didn't react, he continued. Samuel is a good man. I cheers my bait for good reasons. We've been waiting for the day he'd find his mate since we were kids. He paused, grumbling the next part to himself. I should have known. After everything, I cheated to get stuck with a human. Red eyes were staring at me once more. This time, they held me hostage. I couldn't figure out where he was going with his words, or what his statements were tended to suggest. Okay, I trailed off, trying to catch the next few grumblings he made. However, his voice only grew lower so that only he could hear his words. Riley then shook his head, exasperated. Mates are supposed to make their mates happy, not make their lives a living hell. Ever since Samuel met you, his life has been that. I can only assume it's because of what a pain in the ass you are. I raised my eyebrows. Quick retorts come into my tongue. Riley waited for me to voice them, but I bit them back. Knowingly, nothing to say. He taunted, frowning. I sighed heavily, though it did nothing to calm me. I refused to play his game. Smart choice. As I was saying, he gestured grandly to Samuel. He deserves to be happy. So you will make him happy or I will make your life a living hell. He pursed his lips, catching my wide eyes. Even for a human to understand. I tried finding my voice. He wouldn't let you hurt me. Maybe. Riley mused. But you have a family, don't you? My breathing stopped. Oh, you do. I believe one of them is already in the hospital. Is he not? This doesn't involve them. I breathed. Riley raised his eyebrows in clear amusement. Oh, how little you know. His words played on my mind and a hard glare found its way into my features. I was beyond angry at him threatening my family. But more than that, I was scared. You see, Samantha, I can make things very difficult for you and your family. It'd be easy. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He paused, flicking something off his shorts. Or you can do as I say and we can all be happy. My breathing quickened as the blood rushed to my heart. It wasn't enough for Riley to drag me back from the brink of freedom. No, he wanted me and everyone I knew put in a cage that only he had the keys to. He wanted to pull my strings and make me play a role I could never fill. What do you want me to do? I bowed my head, my hands curling tightly around my legs. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I'm sure you can manage it. The hard glare sank further into my face as I stared at the ground, waiting for his response. He plastered a smile on his features, clearly enjoying the fact that he had complete and utter control. Let Samuel turn you. My breathing stopped. Riley took my silence as defiance. Listen, if you really love being a human that much, then I guess I'll put my warriors to work. Your brother's name is Will, right? He took the phone out of his pocket and began dialing the number. Panic struck my heart as I lifted my hands at his phone. I'd been anticipating this though, and only tossed it to his other hand. What could be the matter? Samantha? He raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. I struggled with the pain that was rising from my side as I struggled to speak. Please don't hurt them. My hands started to shake as my eyes darted from him to the phone. His expression darkened with sick pleasure. It would take one call one. His hand held up phone, his thumb hovering over the deadly button. Please just leave them alone. They have nothing to do with this. My voice broke. I broke with it. Riley suddenly snarled. If you don't want them hurt, then I suggest you do what I say. I bent my head. My heart ached. My limbs sagged. Even though I knew what would happen to me, I didn't think twice about Riley's deal. I would not risk their lives for anything. Tears started forming in my eyes, threatening to spill, as I whispered my answer. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I'm sorry. What was that? I slowly lifted my gaze. Fat teardrops falling down my cheeks. I'll do whatever you want. Riley smiled. A putrid, triumphant smirk. Yes, you will. Chapter 25. You're not going to run. I watched Riley's smirk widen as the horror slowly crept into my mind. He seemed to know he had complete and utter control, and he was relishing in it. In that moment, the only thing I could manage was keeping myself from screaming. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. In the midst of our silent battle, Samuel stared. We both watched him intently as he groaned and shifted his weight around. For a moment I thought he would wake up and be rid of Riley's company, but eventually, he settled down once more, remaining unconscious. After Samuel's stirring, Riley was slow to bring his gaze back to me. When he did, he had a new light in his eyes. The anger was gone and had quickly been replaced by something that could be mistaken for happiness. This is going to be good, he nodded to himself, his eyes lingering on Samuel's frame. You're not going to screw this up. I found myself nodding. Riley seemed pleased with my reaction as a sincere smile spread across his face. You're Isma, Samantha. I don't think I'm going to have to worry about you. Am I? He waited patiently for my response. I tried finding my voice, but it wouldn't come. His previous threats were still running rapidly through my mind, and it seemed as if I could focus on nothing else. Riley watched me carefully and thought for a moment, rubbing his hand along his stubbledy chin. You've got to make him believe it. You've got to make him believe you're by choice. I nodded, even though I didn't know how that was going to be possible. Samuel knew I hated him and everything he stood for. That would never change. Riley couldn't be more pleased with my reaction. He sat back against the wall and relaxed his shoulders, placing his hands on his knees. A content smile was plastered on his cheeks, and I didn't think it was leaving any time soon. It did seem to light up his features, making him appear much younger than he actually was. Though he had a boyish face, I knew Riley was much older than he seemed. We'll have to have a plan, he eventually mused, shifting his weight. Samuel's a smart guy and I don't want him suspecting anything. Riley looked at me expectantly, but I only nodded my head again. He laughed at my simple motions, shaking his head in disbelief. Maybe if Samuel had known this was all it would take to tame you, he would have done it himself. I closed my eyes, but other than that I didn't acknowledge his comment. I let his words roll off of me and disappear into the cold air. My prior anger threatened to slip through my tongue, but I couldn't let it. Not now that Riley held all the strings. Riley stretched and groaned slightly. His eyes flickered between me and the door as he pursed his lips. Well, it's getting late. Bray is taking too long, and frankly, I'm tired. Riley stood up and slowly made his way to the back room, where he started moving things about. His back was turned to me, and the only thing I could see was his muscles tensing as he reached around, searching for something. Before long, he came back out of the room holding something heavy in his hands. As he approached, I made it out to be a bundle of thick and frayed rope. I watched wearily as he came to kneel next to me, the smile never leaving his face. One of his arms reached for my hands but stopped when I flinched back. I avoided his pointed stare and tucked my arms under my legs, praying he would leave. My eyes rested on the rope and it suddenly felt as if I was being caught all over again. I knew I should be listening to Riley, but I didn't know if I could be tied up again. Not so soon after I'd gotten free. Not when I was alone in a small room with two werewolves. The images of Riley tearing Margaret's head clean off her shoulders were still fresh in my mind. And if I was tied up, it would be even easier for him to do the same to me. He sighed and tucked condescending. You were doing so well, Samantha. Surely you aren't afraid of a little bit of rope. He held out his arms to show me the tangled mess. As he continued speaking, he untangled the material and laid it over his knees. I guess I understand. I mean, those humans were pretty nasty. You can actually thank them for this rope. They've got quite a few handy supplies. He paused, looking at my wary features. His grin slowly turned into a smirk. I do have a good reason for this. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. And it's not just to torture you. We can't have you running off now. I bowed my head, burying my glare. He reached for my hands, easily overpowering my feeble attempts at resistance. My wrists were then clamped in his meaty hands as he started an intricate knot, humming a tune in time with his movements. I tried to follow them, but it was impossible. He moved with precision and speed as if he did this countless times per day. Then again, he probably did. He saw me watching him and suddenly paused, catching my eye. I carefully looked back at him as a thought crossed his features. He tilted his head side and frowned thoughtfully before finally speaking. New plan. At that, he started undoing the ropes around my wrists. I looked at him, bewildered, as my skin came back into view, and he gathered the rope back in his arms. My body stayed frozen when he abruptly stood up and walked back to the small room, depositing the rope in the doorway. When he turned back to me, a different kind of smile was on his face. "You're not going to run?" My eyebrows involuntarily raised. "He'd said the statement casually, as if he'd only been talking about the weather. When I stared into his red eyes, though, I knew there was a more sinister meaning. "What?" I breathed out. "You're going to stay by Samuel's side for when he wakes up." He said it as if it was the simplest thing in the world. My eyes darted to Samuel's unconscious figure. He was still laying by the fire, several blankets covering his body. They rose and fell evenly, keeping time with his heavy breathing. I slowly brought my gaze back up to Riley. Why, he rolled his eyes. "It's part of the plan, isn't it?" My face contorted in confusion. We'd never actually specified a plan for Samuel's and my new relationship, but it seemed Riley had it all figured out. Whether or not he decided to share that plan with me was still undecided. "Plus, like I said," he continued, his voice a tone darker, "you're not going to run. What makes you so sure?" I decided to play his game. If but for a moment. He laughed, but his expression told a different emotion. "Because if we wake up and you're gone, I would have no problem going back home and killing everyone before you even made it out of the forest." My heart started to beat faster as his words sunk in. Even if I did have the chance to run, I wouldn't make it far. By the time the wolves noticed me missing, it wouldn't be hard to overcome me or run ahead. By the time they caught me again, everyone I knew could be dead. Riley noticed my panicked features and loudly scoffed. "Oh, come on now. You didn't think you'd actually be able to outrun a werewolf, did you?" His words stung. They pierced my heart like 1,000 knives. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I thought I could outrun them. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I thought I could get away. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I had hoped things could be better. I was slowly realizing that hope was useless. It had more than enough chances to run, and they all ended the same way. I got caught. I got captured. And now, my family would pay the price for it. They would be killed if I didn't comply with everything the wolf told me to do. There was no way around it. They were smarter, faster, and stronger. I was merely a human who had the delusion I could escape them. The thought of freedom was nothing more than an unattainable fantasy. "I won't run," I whispered, closing my eyes. Countless emotions threatened to spill out, but I willed the tears away and let numbness slowly overtake me. "No, you won't," Riley sang. "Like I said, you're a smart little human." Riley was at my side in the next instant, hoisting me off the ground. His grip was rough, but it was demanding and forceful. He kept a steady hand on my upper arm and shoulder as I stumbled a bit, dizzy from the sudden change in position. Along with that, the wound in my side started to burn once more, and I was sure how much more blood I could lose. Riley didn't seem to care about this, though, as he pushed me forward towards the edges of the fire. My feet fell over one another and he sighed, annoyed. After a long minute of me stumbling and Riley spit fury mumbling, we reached Samuel's side. Riley led me next to the front of his body and let go of my bicep. I immediately fell to the ground, momentarily surprised at the warmth spreading around me. My arms brought the blanket tighter around my shoulders as I relished in the new feeling. I didn't think he'd be sleeping, But at least now I didn't have to be cold. I watched as Riley retreated to the other side of the room. He settled in a corner where he could see each part of the house clearly. There was a door or window he wouldn't know that opened. It was hard to notice that from his new position. He could watch Samuel and me as well. I kept my gaze down, bowing my head and letting my hair cover my features. I kept an eye on Riley through the parting strands. His eyes soon closed as he leaned up against the corner where the walls met and let his head fall behind him. His shoulders were squared and arms folded, and he looked completely and utterly relaxed. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. What did he have to worry about? He knew I wouldn't run. My gaze finally fell on Samuel, beckies of the shadows from the flames. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel the warmth of his body. I was sitting maybe a foot away from him, directly next to the fire. If he opened his eyes, it'd be the first thing he'd see. Only time would tell whether or not that was a good thing. I skinned Samuel once more before shifting my weight away from him and closer to the fire. Riley didn't say anything, so I figured he was letting himself fall asleep. I held my hands out to the flames, sighing as the warmth danced along my fingertips. I watched the fire for a moment before my eyes traveled up to the door just beyond the flames. It was run down like colored wood and it looked as if it would fall apart at any minute. To be honest, I wasn't sure how it was still standing. I thought for a moment of what was beyond that door. An open forest. It would be so easy to leave. I'd just have to wait for Riley to fall asleep. Then I could slip into the night like before. I could hide. I could run. I could leave all of this behind me. I shook my head, biting down forcefully on my lip, allowing the sensation to bring me back to reality. There was no getting out and I was foolish to think anything different. There would be no more running. There would be no more freedom. I couldn't risk all of my mother's lives. It worked too hard to let them die at the hand of some arrogant beast. I brought my knees to my chest, hugging them tightly. I didn't know what to do. It seemed as if I'd spent my entire life knowing that someday I would be free of all of this, and it'd free my family too. Somehow, somewhere, it would happen. Maybe where I'd even find my father along the way. But now, Riley was forcing me to become the thing I hated most in this life. He was forcing me to become a monster, a bloodthirsty, power-hungry, killer agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. And if I refused, I'd kill the only thing I had left. It was next to impossible to think of myself as one of them. Not only was I not a killer, but there weren't many humans who made the change. Anymore. None that I knew personally, but stories circulated. Rumors were heard. Any human who attempted to shift went through hell to survive it. Many didn't. It's why the werewolves stopped changing people. In the first place, my mother always told me that they were killing people faster than they could turn them. If Samuel and Riley really did force me to turn, who's to say I would even survive? My thoughts were cut short as Samuel started moving once again. His breathing came out rapidly as his legs twitched. I glanced back to Riley to notice him awake, but he hadn't moved any closer to us. He was watching Samuel intently, looking for any sign he'd do more than just mindlessly move his limbs. I turned back to watch him, too, noticing how he was moving more now than he had the entire night. I held my breath as I inched to the side, letting the light from the fire light up his features. And then, Samuel's eyes opened. Chapter 26. Faking Riley was behind me in an instant. We both watched with bated breath as Samuel's eyes peacefully fluttered open. He was still for just a moment before everything came crashing down onto his consciousness. His eyes suddenly widened and his muscles tensed, ready to attack the first thing they saw. Riley's voice instantly came from behind me. Samuel, it's all right. Samuel's eyes darted up to Riley, but before he could respond, he saw me. His frantic gaze softened immediately as he scanned me once over. He propped himself up on one elbow as he did so, bringing his other hand to rub the length of his face. I watched him timidly, very aware of Riley standing directly behind me. his feet digging into my hips. Samuel continued staring at me, and I stared back. I was sure what to say, and it seemed he wasn't. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. His expression held 1,000 different emotions, changing to a different one with each passing second. The one that seemed to keep coming back around, though, was confusion. What exactly happened? He finally asked. I watched the firelight dance across Samuel's furrowed brows. He flicked his gaze to me, scanning my body once again. Almost in disbelief, I lowered my eyes after a while, rubbing my arms and shifting under his gaze. Riley's threats were still fresh in my mind, but I had no idea what to do with that knowledge of Samuel as a whole. It was obvious how Samuel felt and what he wanted, but it spent so long resisting him, I didn't know how to do anything else. Even if it was a feigned reaction. Riley spoke up. One of them shot you down close to your heart. He paused and nodded his head. And after that, well, I dragged you here. Everyone else finished them off. Bray's gone now to make sure there's no one left. I tensed. Riley had failed to mention that was where Peyton, or as they called him, Gray, had gone. Were they really planning on killing every last human out here? I didn't get the chance to mull it over too long before Samuel noticed my apprehensive state. He reached a hand towards my leg as if to rest it there. However, he got halfway to my body before he froze and retracted his hand. Thinking better of his action, he brought his arm back to rest at his side, but his eyes still lingered on my body. What about you? He finally prodded me. I hesitated, looking away. I was sure how he'd react when I let him run off again, specifically against his orders. Noticing my pause, Riley spoke up. She came back with me. We've been waiting for you to wake up. It's been a lovely time. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Samuel stilled, his eyes the only thing moving. They kept scanning my face, once again in disbelief. He didn't run. I furrowed my eyebrows and started to answer, but Riley cut me off. She didn't. Like I said, she came back with me. It was my turn to be confused. I wanted to turn and ask Riley what he was playing at, but I didn't get the chance. His foot moved the egg into my hip, applying a small pressure. He didn't voice anything, but I knew what he was trying to say. If I told Samuel the truth, it'd pay the price. I looked up to see Samuel staring at me. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I took a deep breath, modeling my words after Riley. What he said hadn't been a lie. It just was the entire story. Achidi caught me running in the woods, but I had come back with him to the safe house. Samuel didn't need to know it was unwittingly unconscious. I came back with Riley. The sentence came out smoother than I expected, surprising even myself. Samuel had been listening carefully to my answer, but as soon as I spoke, his face slowly twisted into a wide and lopsided grin. His expression lit up his entire face and made him into a new person. It was infectious, and had I been in any other situation, I would have smiled too. He shook his head slightly, watching me with a glint in his dark eyes. They lit up with his new expression, and for the first time, I noticed small specks of blue dancing around his irises. As soon as I noticed, though, he finally broke eye contact and tilted his head up to Riley. Achidi'd been watching Samuel closely, but the minute he started smiling, Riley noticeably relaxed. Riley looked down at Samuel and laughed once. You know, you look like shit, Samuel. Samuel returned the gesture. I could say the same for you. He paused, flitting his eyes over me. Both of you. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Riley suddenly started to retreat from behind me, waving his hand lazily. As he spoke, he moved back to the other corner of the room to sit down. Yeah, well, we can't all be as pristine as Bray. Samuel barked out a laugh. It was sudden and abrupt and caught me slightly by surprise. I managed to hold back a flinch, but Samuel noticed my muscles tensing. He lowered his voice somewhat as he responded. Where is he? To my agent extraordinaire, L'Obe. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I told you. H.E.S. finishing them off. I told him to find that leader too. I have a couple questions for her. Placing his hands behind his head and closing his eyes, I tried not to think about his words. Tried not to let them affect me. But questions kept running through my mind. Did he mean they went back to the other safe house? Did they kill every last person out here? I shuddered at the thought. Some of those people were mere children and innocent in all of this. Most of them had nothing to do with Damaria's plan. They'd only been the families that made up the rest of the group. Samuel was quiet and I noticed him watching me. He was probably preparing himself for the impending explosion of my emotions. However, I managed to keep a level face. I forced the pictures of all the innocent people out of my mind and let a dark, numbing sensation take over. How are you feeling? He asked me after a while, his eyes never leaving my face. I noticed he stared me down quite a lot, but I knew now was the time to call him out on it. But that didn't stop me from wishing he would look away to give me a single moment to myself. Fine, I lamely told him. He cocked his head to the side, raising his eyebrows. Clearly, I was not fine, and he could see right through my facade. I heard Riley start to move behind me and panic crept into my heart. My chest tightened as my heart rate increased, and I was sure it was the only thing Samuel could now hear. I tried desperately to slow it and not to look behind me, calming myself with reassuring thoughts. Samuel just had to think everything was normal. It was that hard. My side hurts. I blurted out. He furrowed his eyebrows and looked at my blood, so close. Samuel shook his head, calling over my shoulder. Riley, how long are we staying here? We're staying the night. That LL give you enough strength and brain enough time, he simply stated. Samantha needs to get back. She needs medical attention. But I quickly cut him off. I'm fine. To my agent extraordinaire, L'Obe. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I can manage the night. You were shot too. More than me. To my agent extraordinaire, L'Obe. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. And probably with Silver. You need time to heal. I rambled. I just need some sleep. That's all. Samuel looked at me skeptically. I plastered a smile on my face though, not allowing any other emotion through. Sure, my side burned and ached like nothing else. Sure, I wanted to collapse and sleep for weeks. Sure, I was beginning to feel like passing out. But I couldn't let that show. Riley laughed. She sounds fine to me. Samuel groaned and shifted his weight, lying on his back once more. He stared up at the ceiling and the minute his eyes left mine, I let my smile fall and closed my eyes. Everything threatened to seep in, but I pushed it back. I couldn't lose it. I felt Riley's gaze on me, and no matter how desperately I wanted to avoid it, I turned my head to look back. Sure enough, his red eyes were burning holes into me. He had a deadly expression on his face, and to be honest, it made me want to flinch. But I held his fixed stare. 1,000 threats were poured into his facial expression, and he didn't need his voice to make them known. When I finally realized he was going to look away, I slowly brought my head to face Samuel again. He was still staring intently at the ceiling, as if deep in thought. I held back a sigh and moved to mimic his position. Honestly, the ceiling was a much better view than Riley's cold glares. Samuel didn't move as I laid down a small distance away from him. I stayed close to the fire, so I figured he wouldn't take it personally. The minute I was lying on my back, I felt as if I never wanted to sit up again. Sleep tugged at my eyes, but I refused to let it take me just yet. I didn't want to be sleeping when I was trapped with 2 werewolves who were wide awake. Several silent minutes passed until I was sure both Samuel and Riley were resting. Just as I was allowing myself to slip into unconsciousness as well, though, Samuel's whispers echoed in my ears. "Are you really okay?" It took a moment for me to answer, but I eventually whispered a small, "I will be." Was Riley telling the truth? I furrowed my eyebrows, looking in Riley's direction. Samuel heard my unvoiced concern and again softly spoke. She's asleep." I nodded to myself, thinking of Samuel's question. I was more awake now, but it still confused me. Can't you tell if they GS lying? It's harder with werewolves. Oh, I breathed. I thought carefully for a moment, delicately wording my next sentence. He was right. I came here with him. Samuel was silent for a moment. Why, his question caught me off guard. 1,000 responses flew into my mind. But before I could stop myself, I blurted out the poorest one possible. "I don't know." He laughed once. "I don't get you, Samantha." A smile tugged at my lips. "Honestly, I don't either." "Well, what am I supposed to do about that?" I held back a sigh. The last thing I wanted to do was banter with Samuel. "That's your problem." Samuel laughed again. "I don't see that as much of a problem. More like a challenge." I forced a laugh but didn't say anything. Silence fell for a few minutes. It crept in and filled every crevice of our small room until it was the only thing I could hear. I knew Samuel wasn't asleep yet, for whatever reason, and it was slowly driving me mad. I had things I wanted to know, and now, with Riley asleep, was the best time to ask. "Where's Peyton?" Riley said, "He's off in the forest." I bit my lip, taking care of the rest of them. Samuel was silent for a moment before he reluctantly responded. "Yes, all of them. All of them." Horror crept into my heart, but I tried to keep my voice level. "What's the point? What do you mean?" "I mean, why would you kill all of them?" "The families. Not all of them had something to do with it." Samuel didn't answer for a long time. I didn't think he would. But finally, after several tense minutes, his voice stiffly came out. "It doesn't matter to Rai. They were all technically part of the human resistance. Does it matter to you? What I want doesn't matter. I'm not the alpha." He whispered heavily. I furrowed my eyebrows, opening and closing my mouth several times. There were so many things wrong with what he said, so many retorts I wanted to spit out, but I didn't think I could tell him any of them. Riley might be asleep, but once he woke up it wouldn't be hard for him to know it upset Samuel. Samuel stayed silent, patiently waiting for me to explode. I shook my head once more, just to make sure I wouldn't, before I spoke again. "So, what's the plan now?" Now he paused, surprised at my change of topic. "Right now we should be sleeping. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience and enthusiasm." I meant tomorrow. I could almost hear him shrug. "Not sure. Go back home, I guess. Get you to the doctor." My heart stunned at the word home. We were going back to where we lived, but I was sure I would never see it as home again. When I didn't respond, Samuel shifted his weight and let out a long breath. "Look, I just don't know what's going to happen. I haven't talked to Riley about you yet. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I softly replied. I didn't know what else to say. "No, it's not. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." "I want to talk about things." The tone of his voice raised, he continued. "Can we talk tomorrow? About everything. About us." I closed my eyes, willing back the tears. Never had I planned for there to be an us to talk about. Now, it seemed it was beyond inevitable, and I'd have to fake every last word. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Chapter 27, Pain and Panic. I woke up in the early hours of the morning, countless nightmares fresh on my mind. I was breathing heavily, sprawled out on my back, with my limbs folding over my chest. The fire next to me had died long ago, and small rays of sunlight were emerging from the treetops outdoors. Beads of sweat fell across my forehead, but I quickly wiped them away, thinking only of the images flashing through my weary mind. Sleep had come quickly last night. After Samuel finally let me be, it listened carefully to his measured breathing. Once I was sure he was passed out. However, it was a peaceful slumber I slipped into. Countless and tortuous dreams tormented me. Images of my family, bloody and lifeless, were the main themes. In more than one nightmare, I was the one that had killed them. I was tired, even though I slept. I didn't know how much rest I'd actually gotten. After each nightmare, I'd wake up only to find I was still in the small cement house, still sleeping next to a dying fire. Though I was always shivering, I'd be covered in sweat. When I would finally fall back asleep, another nightmare would ensue. This caused a vicious cycle, the visions only getting exceedingly horrifying and twisted as the night went on. Riley and Samuel never noticed my constant waking-ness, and I made sure to keep it that way. Surprisingly, I'd gotten quite skilled at staying quiet. However, with the images of my bloody family plaguing my mind, I wasn't sure how much longer I would last. I was suddenly called from my thoughts when I heard an abrupt and loud noise right outside the door. I whipped my head to the wall downward, watching carefully for any sign of movement. At the same time, Riley shot up from his position in the far corner of the room, readying himself for any sign of danger. Samuel immediately followed, placing himself directly in front of me. When the door started to open though, they both visibly relaxed. My eyebrows furrowed at a sudden change of demeanor, and I painfully lifted myself to my knees to peer around Samuel's wide frame. Sure enough, the door was fully opened and the morning dew was starting to seep inside. Just beyond the door were 3 figures, though only one of them was standing. When I tried to get a better look at the others, my gaze was cut off by the first from walking towards us. When I saw who the large figure belonged to, I understood Riley and Samuel's instant relief. Peyton Bray was slowly walking into the house, quickly closing the door once he was inside. I immediately noticed he was covered in dirt and missing his shoes. His clothing was slightly torn and his bright blue eyes were tired. This didn't take away from his overpowering presence though. And when he walked through the doorway he seemed to take up the entire room. "Bray, it's about damn time," Riley suddenly growled. "Sorry. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I ran into some problems. He jerked his head behind him, causing Samuel and Riley to follow the motion. Riley nodded, looking back to Peyton. "Why didn't you call? It wasn't anything I couldn't handle." Slowly relaxing, Riley laughed. "Obviously. What happened?" It was then that Peyton's gaze rested on me. Crouching behind Samuel, his cold eyes held mine in a tight hold, never allowing me to leave. It was only a moment he looked at me, but it felt like much longer. Deciphering what his gaze held was impossible, and I soon felt the overwhelming need to apologize for even trying. "Maybe we should talk outside." Finally looking away, Samuel shifted his weight. Glancing down at me, Riley did the same, casually nodding. He didn't say anything but walked past us all and through the door. Peyton quickly followed him, leaving me alone with Samuel. "What was that about?" I quietly asked, falling back to sit on the hard floor. Samuel turned to face me, taking in my ragged state. He shrugged his shoulders in response, not bothering to say anything. I watched him carefully as he started picking up the various things that littered the small room, piling them into bags he pulled from the back. As he worked, all evidence of us spending the night was gradually disappearing. A few silent minutes passed and I could tell Samuel was listening to the conversation happening outside. His face was twisted in concentration, and though he continued packing our belongings, he was distracted. I waited for him to become fully immersed in their conversation before I tensed my muscles, ready to try and stand. I knew from the start it would be difficult, and I didn't want Samuel hovering over me while I made the attempt. I was too stubborn and prideful to admit I needed help. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I failed miserably. My legs gave out and I stumbled to the side, catching my weight on my bad wrist. A mangled cry left my mouth, immediately notifying Samuel of my failed attempt. I desperately tried to readjust myself and play it off, but Samuel was by my side in an instant. He quickly pulled me up from the ground and led me to the small seat of the windowsill. I leaned against it, half sitting and breathing heavily, as Samuel regarded me with concern. "You're not looking good," he mumbled, almost to himself. "Thanks," I muttered. I rolled my eyes before bringing my gaze to the floor. He didn't even know the half of it. I shifted under his intense stare as both of my hands went absently to my side. They'd grow accustomed to resting there, always attempting to ease the constant burning of the gunshot. Samuel followed my motion, his eyes narrowing in on my wound. "We'll get that taken care of when we get back." I stayed silent, not really believing him. If anything waited for me back home, it was more pain. Samuel started to say something, but he was quickly cut off when the door opened. Riley walked through, glancing at the two of us before running his gaze around the room. "Bray is pulling the car up now." Samuel sprang into action, picking up the large backpacks that now scattered the floor. Riley helped him with a few, not bothering to acknowledge me. They both left the room for a minute and I began to wonder if I was expected to follow. Just as I was gathering my strength to walk, Samuel came back in. He held out his hands and stepped towards me. Knowing I had no other options, I took one of his arms in both of my hands, gripping tightly for support. He brought his other arm around my waist, supporting the weight I couldn't manage. Then slowly, he led me out of the house. It was a beautiful morning, and that was an understatement. The trees seemed to glisten with morning dew as rays of sunlight broke through their thick branches. The grass was slightly wet and bright green, with small clumps of weeded flowers scattered to the tree line. From there, they broke off and crept up the rough bark of the trees, molding the scenery into one perfect portrait. I didn't get too long to admire the rare sight before Riley was in front of us, ruining my perfect moment with his red eyes and wide smirk. I tried to hold back a sigh, but it seemed he was too preoccupied to notice any resentment on my part. He regarded Samuel with pursed lips, an unvoiced thought lingering there. "Peyton's bringing the truck." He finally spoke, his words coming out slow and careful. Samuel nodded, understanding flashing across his face. Before he could respond, though, Riley spoke again. "HES got a load in the back. What I asked him to grab." Samuel scrunched his face in confusion, watching Riley carefully. I mimicked his actions, noticing Riley's unusually cryptic words. However, after a moment, understanding dawned on Samuel. He was silent, furrowing his eyebrows in concentration. Samuel's eyes darted to mine for a quick moment as he finally responded. "There's some blankets back in the house." Riley smirked again and nodded, casually strolling past us and back into the white, stone building. I watched him for a moment before Samuel began pulling me forward, diverting my attention. "What was that about?" I asked slowly. Samuel shrugged. "Nothing." Annoyance tugged at my heart and I cowed and helped but grow heated from his response. My carefulness were out the window, quickly replaced with my temper. "Obviously it's something. You just won't tell me." He glanced back at the building inside. "Yo, it's nothing. Bray brought the truck, so I'm going to sit with you in the back. There's not enough room up front." And I did panting. "And nothing." He spoke lightly. "Riley's got some stuff back there and wanted to know how to make the ride more comfortable. Don't tread too much into it." I raised my eyebrows, my lips forming a tight line. Before I could retort, Riley was back in front of us. I jumped at his unexpected and prompt arrival. He smiled lightly, glancing at Samuel before clearly noticing my irked expression. "Trouble in paradise." Samuel scoffed, and I quickly darted my gaze to the grass, hiding my annoyance. I could feel Riley's eyes on me though, and I knew the message his sentence implied. I had to make Samuel happy, not give him trouble. No matter. Riley spoke after an awkward silence. "Bray's ready. Come on." He started walking to the other side of the building, and Samuel and I immediately followed. When we came to the opposite end of the clearing, a large truck was pulling up from a gap in the trees. It was white with a small, two-person cabin and an extended back half. Peyton jumped from the front seat and moved to the back, lifting a latch to raise the sliding metal door covering the trunk. Samuel guided us to where Peyton stood and whisked as he finished lifting the door. Inside, the truck was dark and stuffy. Various things were scattered along the floor, everything pushed up to the walls. A few small items had fallen from their place though, littering the floor. I quickly scanned the items, searching for anything suspicious or covered in blankets. My eyes rested on a small heap to the left of the truck where multiple blankets covered what was underneath. "Ray?" Samuel suddenly asked. I was brought back to the moment as Samuel removed his arm from my shoulder, causing me to stagger slightly. He quickly steadied me though, holding firmly to my arms. Feeling eyes on me, I glanced up to see Peyton curiously watching Samuel's gentle grasp. Peyton suddenly spoke. "It really is true. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Samuel glanced up at Peyton only to see he was staring at me once more. I avoided his gaze though, knowing it would hold me captive and cause fear to quickly rise. I watched Samuel's face flash with an untold emotion. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Peyton shrugged, putting his hands in his pockets. "It's hard to believe. You can't blame me." Samuel paused, thinking for a moment. "I wouldn't believe it myself if it didn't happen to me." He laughed once, adjusting his grip on my arms. I tried following their conversation, but once again I felt eyes on me. I looked up to see Riley standing a few feet away, arms crossed and eyes blazing. He was staring me down, forcing every threat possible into one look. I flinched back, wishing I hadn't looked up in the first place. Samuel noticed and took the motion for Payne. "Let's get you in, Samantha." Samuel softly spoke. He nodded to Peyton, who returned the gesture before walking back around the truck. When he was gone, Samuel's gaze softened, resting on me. He searched my features, smiling sadly. "This is probably going to hurt." Before I could respond, HED picked me up, one arm under my legs and the other supporting my back. I gasped in shock and pain at his sudden movements, but as quickly as it happened, I was released once more. Confused, I opened my eyes. I hadn't realized did shut to see I was at the back of the truck, leaning against the hard metal surface. Samuel was back at the entrance, quickly sliding the door back down. When he did, I was overcome with complete and suffocating darkness. I could hear Samuel's footsteps coming back towards me, and I suddenly wanted nothing more than to be far, far away from him. I don't know if it was the darkness, my pain, or the uncertainty of the entire scene, but something inside of me was threatening to snap. I tried desperately to keep my breathing steady and my heart rate normal. However, the closer he came, the faster they both went. When he was standing in the space in front of me, I was close to having a panic attack. "Samantha, what's wrong?" Samuel asked, quickly crouching in front of me. I couldn't see his face, but I suddenly felt his hand on my leg. I flinched violently, scooting back further into the wall. The movements hit my side and I gasped in pain, willing the sensation to the back of my mind. I couldn't deal with both pain and panic. I knew that Samuel was confused and I could hear his soft words attempting to soothe me. However, my breaths were already being cut short. It breathed in as much air as my lungs could hold, but it didn't seem as if I could exhale. but each time I did my lungs wouldn't comply. Suddenly, it felt as if I was suffocating. My hands reached up to my chest, pushing against my heart and neck, trying hopelessly to make my body obey my mind. Then suddenly, it was light again. It was the same light as before, but a white and unnatural glow that cast harsh shadows. I blinked several times as my eyes adjusted. When they did, I saw Samuel was still crouched in front of me, but he was holding a small phone in his hand, the white light coming from the tip. Now that I could finally see, my heart decided to start calming down. My lungs shakily exhaled the air they'd taken on, and when they did, I realized how dizzy I suddenly was. When Samuel saw my head spin, he carefully moved to sit next to me, holding the phone steadily in his hand. I barely noticed his movements as I could only focus on further calming myself down. After several tense and quiet moments, I finally heaved a large sigh. My hands left my chest and rested in my lap as I fumbled with my fingers. Samuel was still sitting next to me, unmoving. I dared a glance in his direction, only to find he was staring right at me the entire time. I shied away from his intrusive stare, looking instead at my feet. His voice met my ears, barely above, a whisper. "Are you all right? What happened?" I shook my head. The last thing I wanted to do was talk, but I knew he wouldn't let me ignore him. "I don't know. It just got darkened," I sighed, searching for an answer to my anxiety. I soon found there wasn't one. "I don't know." Samuel nodded, shifting his weight and slowly bringing a hand to mine. I tried not to flinch, but I was suddenly so overcome with exhaustion. It was hard. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noban. Thoughts out thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I should have thought about that. The truck suddenly started moving. I whipped my head up, looking around as various small objects fell haphazardly to the ground. Samuel noticed them too and let out a small laugh. Trying to diffuse the tension, he watched me anxiously, waiting for me to break down once more. I managed a small smile to let him know that for the moment, I was all right. As the truck bounced along the road, several more items bounced with it. I watched twirly as backpack slipped, supplies falling from their contents. One smaller bag fell on the heap on the far side of the truck and bounced lightly to the ground. I watched, confused, as it pulled a piece of blanket along with it. My eyes widened at what I saw when the blanket had been pulled away. A cold chill ran up my spine and a large pit settled in my stomach. My face paled and my hands went slack, no longer mindlessly fidgeting with my shirt. "Samantha?" Samuel questioned, following my gaze. When his eyes rested on what I saw, his face flashed with apprehension. He tried speaking again, but I was already gone. There was nothing that could pull me away from the thing sticking out from the blanket. Nothing that would erase the image from my mind. Nothing that would stop the fear seeping into my skin. It was lying limply in the air as if suspended by invisible strings. Blood was seeping through, dripping to the metal floor. The shadows from Samuel's light only aided in the deadened cold or emanating from its tips. A hand,